Welcome back to Securing the Telework Workforce, sponsored by RSA here on Federal News Network. My guests today are Robert Carey. He's the Vice President and General Manager for Global Public Sector Solutions at RSA. Karen Evans, Chief Information Officer at the Department of Homeland Security. And Brian Gattoni is Chief Technology Officer at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And let's talk about TIC 3.0. The Trusted Internet Connection is a long-standing program, Brian, of Homeland Security. Now that there is the formation of CISA and the refocusing of that whole effort, tell us what's going on with TIC 3.0, how this applies, especially in this new distributed world that we're all living in.
Absolutely. So, TIC 3.0 and the effort there, predates our current environment, but is extremely relevant to it. It was to give guidance to enable CIOs to make risk-based decisions as they moved to more flexible architectures and could access cloud resources and incorporate them into their overall design, and do so from a secure, informed posture. One of the things that's critical to it is understanding, as these agencies move their individual ways to adopt these cloud technologies, what does that do to their risk surface? What does that do to the data needs, the telemetry needs of the security professionals in the agencies for individual action, and at CISA for overwatch, to understand the health and risk and effects on those networks? And then during the course of this, back in April, we issued some interim guidance to help CIOs understand how they can employ some of these capabilities in their advanced telework stages. So broadly supportive of a wide spectrum of architectural approaches. We try to take into account the use of VPNs, right? Expand thoughts to virtual desktop interfaces and desktop as a service capabilities, and give some insights into adoption of zero trust capabilities as CIOs move their way to those environments.
We're really dealing with a matrix, if you will, as opposed to just everyone accessing the mainframe like they might have done 20 years ago, which was almost a virtual desktop interface version of the 3270 session, where you're just going back from one host to that computer. Now everyone's accessing everything all over the place. And so, Karen, I guess that really gets into it's kind of a government-wide issue, with Homeland Security being maybe the guinea pig, as you mentioned earlier, with combining those SOCs and NOCs, because everything is so matrixed.
Well, and the key here is, and Brian hit on that, is the ability to manage your risk profile. So you have to really know what is the risk tolerance of what your leadership, what your users, what they need to be able to sustain, and then engineer solutions to that. So technology is there, right? I mean, Rob will attest to all of that. But I think what you really have to really discuss is, what is your risk tolerance? And as you start doing this, you've mentioned a whole host of different technologies. We've talked about cloud. We're talking about network capabilities. We've talked about innovation, using TIC 3.0 to be able to help bring in different things. But the other part of that, and Brian talked about this earlier, is you're then inheriting risk from different places, and you have to know what that risk is that you're inheriting. And so I am in this last little piece going to bring up a couple things which is related to supply chain risk management. So as we start talking about this and we move to cloud, I'm inheriting the risk of my cloud provider. This is where programs that have been out there really become critical, like FedRAMP, right? That's important, because then we have to really understand what our cloud providers are doing. So when DHS CISA at that point issues something that is important for all of us to be able to do, I have to turn around to the cloud providers within DHS that are providing my mission service, and I have to ensure that they are taking those same precautions that I would if I had a mainframe, like what you're talking about. I have to be able to have a way to attest that they've actually done it. So now we're into, how did I deploy the TIC architecture? How did I actually deploy the CDM architecture that then gets back into the NOSC and the SOSC in order for me to be able to manage it and have that common operating view of what is happening in this hybrid world that you described?
Yeah, and Rob, let me ask you a related question, because people are accessing resources in the cloud, in the data centers, from one another laterally in many cases. And often people are accessing services from the cloud to enable access somewhere else because their cloud software services also besides hosting. And so that gets into the issue of something we talked about very early in the discussion, and that is the multi-factor authentication. And the extension to that is single sign-on. And how do you ensure that people have the right lateral mobility once they're inside the network, once they're past the original authentication, but yet not get what they're not supposed to have? That gets pretty fine-grained and somewhat complex when people are remote so much.
Yeah, it really does. And you know, implementing role-based access across government data sets is pretty difficult, right? Because we have, you know, completely unclassified information, we have controlled unclassified or FOU, and then we get into the security classifications of information. And the higher you go, the more easily that's done because the less people who actually have access to that level of network to get into it. So to me, you know, the multi-cloud environment, the hybridization of the entire network really does draw, and I think Brian and Karen have both mentioned this, this is all about the data. This is a data-centric security view. And then it is also overlapping that, and I think both Karen and Brian have said this, there's some organization that must have a view of that overlay, right? And DHS for the civilian world, Cyber Command for the military world, right? Somebody has that view who can determine that something is amiss. And so you know, multi-factor authentication is a way, for example, to demonstrate I am who I say I am. But now what am I getting into? The network, an application and data, you know, multiple applications data. I'm in an environment. So the CISOs and CIOs really have to sit and think about what am I affording that access to? And what are the credentials that must be presented to make that sufficient to render that access? Similarly, on top of that overlay, who's staring at that and says, hey, that Karen Evans gal is getting into an ERP solution with HR information she's not authorized to see. How do we stop that, right? How do we know that that's going on? So to me, this tolerance for digital risk management, or this desire to really stare at where am I encountering risk and how do I mitigate it? I'm thrilled that I know we're not there yet, but I'm thrilled that the agencies embrace that and are moving ahead with reducing that risk, because it only takes one of these things. One of the bad guys has to be right, and they're in.
Yeah, and a follow-up prompted by something Karen said too, and you mentioned supply chain risk, which is part of this larger equation. And you have your, you know, contracting officers, your 1102s, they are interacting not just with agency resources, but with a great deal of supply chain resource. And so there's connections there. Now they're coming from people's homes to the contractors and the bidders, as opposed to from inside the agency. And so I imagine that's a complicating factor, because then we've discussed inheritance. In some ways, you either inherit or take on whatever risks they have had. And since not everyone is CMMC level 5 yet, we'll have to wait another generation for that to happen. You've got the industry you've got.
You have the industry that you have, but I do believe that as this administration has moved forward, you are seeing, for example, in Congress is enabling a lot of this. And so last year with an NDAA, right, there was a specific provision in place that talked very specifically about 5 companies that the federal government cannot do business with. I mean, it's really very simple. It's not saying that you can't, as a private industry company, do stuff, but if you're going to choose to do business within the federal government, then you can't have these covered entities there. You're seeing it with 5G. You're seeing it with, as we move out through supply chain. And what we have to really take a look at is, what does the United States risk posture want to be? And then how are we doing that? So this administration is addressing that. It permeates everything that we're doing. And so if we are buying products or we are buying services from contractors. The contractors, if they want to do space in the, and business in the federal government in this space, then they have to attest, and we have to be able to look at what those business processes are and how they are doing that attesting, right? So that's why I'm back to with the cloud providers and what FedRAMP has done. There was a lot of foresight into that, right? Now you can just ratchet up that process because it becomes part of the procurement process, to your point. So these then become terms and conditions within the contract. The contracting officer can make sure the right terms and conditions are in there, but it's the CIO operational capabilities that have to make sure that we're enforcing those terms and conditions. And if a vendor is not meeting that, then we have to be able to provide the evidence back to CISA if they have to make certain decisions government-wide, and back to our contracting officer for the performance of that particular contract. So this whole common operating picture that we're trying to do as we move into and continue to maintain this type of environment where we're in flux and we're in telework, that way to be able to monitor it becomes very critical, for all these paths of what we want to do.
And Brian, a follow-up for you, because these rules do get sometimes, they start out as proposals or executive orders or regulations or proposed regulations, but then they get codified, which means you have to have regulations. And I'm thinking of something that looks like it's going to be in the NDAA for 2021, and that is a ban on TikTok in Defense Department issued devices, and that could spread to the entire civilian complex of devices. And, it sounds humorous because, people laugh at TikTok, but that's a very specific policy that gets to a bigger issue. And that is what else is adjunct to what people are doing for the federal government as they telework on their devices, whether they're government devices or they're using personal devices. And so with that as proxy for a bigger question, what's the best guidance, from CISA on the whole TikTok type of conundrum?
So TikTok, Stadia, Pokemon Go, there's a lot of innovations in the application space to provide, recreation and entertainment that's hosted on a personal device that happens to be on my body as I go to work. And so being personally mindful of the type of data those systems collect and mindful of where that data goes and what can be done with it. It's a responsibility we need to educate each individual on as they go. All these specific technologies, if we just don't know where they send the data and what's inferable from that data, there's risk there that has to be managed.
Yes, because I can imagine a scenario where someone might, I don't know, pay for a government product or service that's under the micro threshold level and use their government credit card, the data of which might be on their device. And therefore that would be seeable by some application or other.
Sure. There's a lot of obvious fault modes at a very micro level that folks need to be cognizant of what their macro implications are if they're realized.
Yeah. Rob, comment?
Well, this goes back to every user is really now part of the network infrastructure. Every user is a cyber defender, right? And so if you don't ask yourself the questions that Brian just illuminated, right, and then weigh the risk in your head, whether you decide you want to mess with that app and where the data goes, you are putting yourselves probably in jeopardy. I go back to, because you embrace FedRAMP and you embrace a FedRAMP impact level 2 or FedRAMP moderate cloud to put your information, it doesn't relieve the organization of the responsibility to monitor it, right? To understand what's going in and going out. Because remember, the advanced persistent threat doesn't necessarily bring a slow pitch softball to the game. They bring the Max Scherzer fastballs. And so you have to understand what could occur and what the impact of that could be should it occur to mission. And so it brings me back to everyone's mindful of cyber in the 21st century here, especially in this distributed workforce, when we're not comfortable that we're staring at a display on our office in the Pentagon at 7th and D, wherever it happens to be, or in Ballston, and everything's fine. I had a day in the Pentagon where a very senior person said to me, if it showed up on my screen, I thought it was secure. Right? And I won't say who it was, but the fact that it was on the network, on the display, meant it was secure to him. And I said, well, that's not actually the case. But remember, there's a lot of people out there that are not yet 21st century cyber warriors, and nor will they be. But they do have to have some fundamental understanding of what is going on and the risks associated with it. And when they can't quantify the risks, it probably tells you shouldn't be there.
All right, and I think that's about all the time we have. A good note to end this panel discussion on. I want to thank today's guests. Robert Carey is the Vice President and General Manager for Global Public Sector Solutions at RSA. Karen Evans is the Chief Information Officer at the Homeland Security Department. And Brian Gattoni is the Chief Technology Officer at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agencies. Thank you all very much. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. You've been listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search RSA.